The quilt top for our fourth grandchild is finished, and it's time to pull this project all together and finish the quilting and bind the quilt. I'm going to show you how easy it is to do, so come along. Hey friends, it's Barbara Sue at Kowalski Mountain. Welcome back to our channel. If you've been following along, I've been working on a baby quilt from start to finish, and we are on the final steps of the baby quilt so that we can give this to our fourth grandchild and his mama and daddy. Now, baby Hunter arrived just a couple of days ago, and I was able to finally finish the embroidery and add his name to the front of the quilt. So today we're going to learn how to sandwich a quilt, how to do the quilting, and also how to bind the finished quilt. So let's get started. Now, if you're just joining us, I designed this baby quilt using the book Once More Around the Block, and I've done a complete playlist of all of the videos in the step. I show you how I design a quilt, how I cut it out, how I sew it together, how I do the embroidery and the applique, and finally we're going to learn today how to do the actual quilting. Now, I know we've called it a quilt the entire time, and each step we've called it quilting, but quilting is actually the sewing together layers of fabric. And so today we are finally getting to the actual quilting step. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make a quilt sandwich, and that's exactly what it sounds like. We're going to make a sandwich with the backing fabric, the binding, and also the quilt top. So let's show you what those pieces are. Now, for my backing fabric, I chose this blue fabric. Now, I actually knew that baby Hunter's name was going to be Hunter when I started. It was his middle name that I waited so long for. And I considered putting a hunter green on the back just for that reason, but I liked this fabric better. The green fabric that I used in the quilt has some vines on it, and it's kind of on the florally side. I don't like to use floral patterns in quilts for boys, and that's actually one of the reasons I decided to go with this blue instead of the green. In the little bits of touches that it's in the quilt top, it doesn't scream florally quilt, but on the back, this is a big piece of fabric, so you're definitely going to see that feel. So that's why I went with this blue. Now, this is the first step of our sandwich. Now, the next step in our sandwich is the batting. And batting is just a soft, plush fabric that goes in the middle. Now, you may have seen quilts that have a real thick batting, but this is a natural batting that this is much easier to quilt through. You'll see that this is not very thick. We're not looking for a thick, lofty quilt. We're just looking for warmth. Now, this is 100% cotton. This is going to be a very nice, warm quilt. It's going to be washable, and it's going to be easy to sew through. Now, the final layer of the quilt sandwich is the quilt top. And this is what we've been working on for so many weeks. We first created the actual quilt blocks, and then we created the embroidery. We put it all together, and we have a top. And this is the showpiece of the quilt. Now, just so you know, I've already ironed all of this. As you know, pressing is not a step that you can skip in quilting. It's very important. So both the top and the backing fabric has been ironed. The first step is to lay the back of the quilt with the right side down. Now, we want to lay that out as smoothly as we can. Now, I'm doing this on the floor, and it's actually easier to sandwich a quilt on the floor, at least for me, because you have the carpet underneath. That's a little bit helpful when you're doing this process. Shoo, shoo, shoo. Now, the next step is to lay out the batting, and I have not pre-cut this. So it's going to be a little bit bigger than it needs to be. Now, just so you know, I already vacuumed really well before I started this project. Now we want to make sure that the backing didn't move at all, and it actually did, so I pulled it out because we want to get this as smooth as we possibly can. Now the last part of the quilt sandwich is the top, and we're going to lay that down face up. Now my backing and my batting are bigger than the quilt top, and that's done on purpose because we don't want the quilt to shift while we're quilting it and not have any edge around the outside. So there is a little bit of waste in the way that I'm doing this. I'm making it a little bit bigger and probably a little bit bigger than I need to, but it makes me feel good and it makes me feel safe that I'm not going to have issues later. So I just want to check. Here's the edge of my quilt, and my blue is in there, so I'm well from the edge on the sides. Now that the quilt sandwich is laid out, we're going to pin it together. And there's different ways that you can do this. You can do it with a needle and thread, and you can baste it. I've actually never done that method before. People use spoons, and they use the spoon underneath to scoop and catch the needle, and I've never done it that way. I always use pins. Now you can use specially designed pins that have a curve in them that are used for this exact purpose. I don't think my pins are curved. My pins aren't curved and they're going to work just fine. Now when we start pinning, we start in the center for the exact same reason. If the fabric shifts, we want to make sure that we don't run out of space on the edges. So we're going to start right here in the middle of the medallion. And we're just going to go down, and I have carpet, makes it easy. And we're going to pin those layers together. Now, it should have gone all the way through. You can check if you want. I'm not going to disturb my quilt sandwich if I don't have to. Now we just keep pinning until the entire quilt top is pinned. That turned out to be the perfect amount. That's going to work great. I am going to cut the extra batting just because it's going to be a little bit easier to handle. Now before I do that, I'm going to check my edges. This is more around the edge than I really need. It makes me feel better to know I'm not going to have any issues. Now this end, I cut it close. So now the quilt sandwich is complete, and it's time to do the quilting. I've been thinking about this for a few days, because I'm really not sure how I'm going to quilt it even still. Now the blocks of the quilt, I'm going to do a technique called stitch in the ditch, and that's super simple. I'm going to stitch around this square, and I'm going to stitch around this star right in the ditch of my seam line. Now for this, I'm going to stitch in the ditch around this too. I'm going to stitch around this and this and this, and that's going to be in the square. The center is the part that I have been thinking about quite a bit actually, because I'm not really sure how to do it. Now I don't have a fancy foot for my sewing machine. I don't quilt that often, so I don't have all the fancy gadgets for quilting. And so I don't have a free form foot. You don't want to leave too large of areas not quilted, because those sections are going to tear or break down inside, the batting inside, through washing and using and things like that. So you want the layers to be well sewed together. All right, so this is ready. Let's get quilting. I just had a close call. I'm getting ready to quilt this. I have everything laid out, and Eric and Jess showed up here with the baby. Thankfully, I have the windows open today and I could hear them coming, and I rushed and I threw it in the bedroom and didn't let them in the house. So, unfortunately, they know I'm up to something. I have kept it a secret until now. I am like days away from being done, and I kept it a secret up until now. But now they know I'm up to something. They don't know what, just something. Which will make sense why I have been hounding them about this baby's name for weeks. They have to think I have this weird obsession with middle names, because I asked every time I saw them if they had this baby's name yet. So they waited and revealed it on delivery day, so I couldn't even move beyond that point until then. But we've got it, and we're within days of finishing this baby quilt. So right now I'm going to do some prep. These are the bobbins that go into the bottom of the sewing machine. If you're not familiar with sewing, machines have a bottom thread and a top thread. This holds the bottom thread. I go ahead and load a few bobbins ahead of time so I don't have to stop in the middle and do it then, because you have to thread the machine differently to wind a bobbin. When you're sewing multiple layers of fabric, you have to use a special foot called a walking foot, and mine must be in storage. It's not in my sewing box, which is very upsetting, but thankfully my mother-in-law had one, and so I am back in business and I can continue. The reason you need a walking foot is on the bottom of your sewing machine there are little feet, and that makes the fabric move along. Now, because I'm sewing multiple layers of fabric, I need the feet, the presser foot on the top, to walk with it as well. The walking foot helps those fabrics move together so they lay nice and flat. It can be done without, and I've done it without, but a walking foot does make it easier. Now, whenever I've made full-size quilts, and I've made 3 twin quilts, I always have those quilted at a quilting shop that has a free arm machine. They're not bound to just this little bitty area for the quilt, but with baby quilts, I can usually get it done without too much trouble. Now, just like the pinning of the quilt, we're going to start sewing in the middle of the quilt too, so any shifting moves to the outside. Now, technically I should really do the centerpiece, but I still don't know what I'm going to do. So let's just do the parts that I can do, and I'm going to leave the parts that I'm undecided to till later. So I have my fabric in the ditch, and my needle is down, and we start sewing. Now I have a pin here that's in my way. So I'm taking that out. Now I'm to a corner, so I've got my needle down. I'm going to lift up my foot, and I'm going to turn the quilt. Now I put my foot back down and we keep sewing. Phew. Well, that was interesting. The walking foot holds on to the screw that holds your needle in. And my needle just came out. Now we're all still in business here. Thankfully it didn't break. Get that back up in there. There we go. Back in business. Now we're to the corner, so we're going to turn it. So we made it around the first square, around the blue, and on the, I'm sorry, we've gone around the white, the medallion. Now we're going to go around the, I set up for the green. I'm going to go ahead and do the green because I'm set up for it, but I need to go back and do around this blue. So here's the next row. Now, if you haven't heard my motto yet, your seam ripper is your friend. And no one ever thinks it's your friend, but trust me, it is. Now, I made a little mistake while I was doing my sewing. So I went down the wrong way, one of my trips down my ditch here. So thankfully I caught it really quickly. So I didn't do the whole seam. I quit right away. So I'm just going to pull that out. Honestly, these kinds of mistakes, probably no one notices but me. Now, a quilter would notice. But when you're machine quilting a quilt, you're not showcasing your stitching. This is a baby quilt, so it's going to be used. I want them to use it. I want them to wash it. I want the baby to spit up on it. It's for the baby. And if those things aren't happening, then they're not using it. While we want to do a good job with our stitching, we're not showcasing it to where it needs to be extra special. And my star is back the way it should. Now this is a little disappointing. This is probably loose threads. I'm probably doing something to make these happen. I'm not sure what, but they're certainly not pretty. At least it's a lucky quilt. So I have 3 blocks done, and now we just continue this process until all the blocks are done. And it's going by really quickly, so I'm confident that I'm going to get it done tonight. Now that center section, I still don't know what to do. We'll finish the easy stuff, and then I'll worry about that later. All right, we are in the home stretch of the quilting, and I actually drew on my quilt. I don't know if you can see the lines. This is a water-soluble marker. So with water, it's just simply going to disappear. Now, I tested this on a scrap piece of fabric before I drew on my quilt. I had 2 water-soluble markers. One was blue, one was pink. The blue dissolved right away. The pink did not. So I did not draw on my quilt in pink. Now, when it's very humid in the air, these can also disappear just from the humidity. So be mindful of that if you live in a humid area. I don't usually use these just for that reason. But this isn't going to take me a real long time, so my design is not going to just disappear. Now, Philip and I put our heads together, and we decided to make the quilting in this block to be part of the design. I had already drawn a cloud around this quote up here, and around the sunshine we put rays down for the sunshine, and then down at the bottom we tried to make some contour to make it look like the ground behind it. So we're trying to add some dimension using the quilting, and that's part of what quilting does, is it gives your quilt character. Looks pretty good on the front. Let's check the back. Not bad at all. Actually looks pretty good. I'm happy with that. I'm glad I did it. Now I have one more thing to show you tonight, and then I'm calling it a night. Now the pen I used to do the markings for the quilting is water soluble, so we need to take that off as soon as possible. You don't want to leave it on there. I have had it disappear in the humidity, but we're going to go ahead and get it off now. Well, that was it. That was all there was to it. And now I need to go ahead and clean up all these little strings, which I'm going to do. And we only have one more step. Believe it or not, we're finally to the end. One more step. We need to make the binding, and we need to bind it. And then the quilt will be finished, and we can present it to baby Hunter and Jess and Eric. Hey friends, I'm going to be real with you. In this next portion of the video that's coming up, it was really challenging. And it's not that it was things that I don't know how to do. I've made many quilts. I know very well how to do these things that you're going to see next. But let me tell you, there was obstacle after obstacle after obstacle, and everything just was so much harder than it needed to be. So I'm being real. What you're going to see, this was a tough bit of clip, but the end result is this quilt is almost done. So come along, let's see the obstacles that I had while I was working on the binding of this quilt. All right, we are to the final steps of this baby quilt. And the next step that we need to do is to create the bias binding. Now, what a bias binding means is it means it's cut across the grain instead of up and down with the grain. So normal cut of a binding would be up and down. A bias binding is cut across the binding. And the reason we do that is because it is more wear friendly. It has a little bit of stretch to it, whereas the straight bias doesn't have as much stretch. So you can see here, I'll stretch this just a little bit this way. Now when I stretch it this way, I've got more stretch. Do you see that? And so in using a quilt every day, going through the washing machine, being tucked onto your bed, being dragged around, wrapped around you, the edges of the quilt are going to get a lot of wear and tear. And a bias binding holds up to that activity better than a binding that's cut straight on the grain. Now, in a quilt like this one behind me, that is a wall quilt, it doesn't get any wear and tear. It hangs on the wall and no one really messes with it. So that kind of a quilt you can do a straight binding on, and it's no problem. You would just cut your binding, you'd fold it over the edges of the quilt, and you'd sew it down, and that would be fine. But with a bias binding, we have to do a little preparation to prepare it on the bias. Now, years ago, I bought a card in the fabric store that gave me all the instructions of how to do it, how to lay it out, the sizes to cut it, everything. And that's lost in storage someplace right now. Meaning I have it, I just can't get to it. So today I looked up the instructions so that I would remember how to do it, because it's been a few years since I've made a quilt. And I figured out my dimensions. Now, in order to put a binding on this quilt, I need 157 inches of binding. And to do that, I needed to do some math. And with that math, I determined that I needed a 20-inch square to create enough bias binding for this baby quilt. Now, it's going to be a little extra, which you always want to make a little extra just in case. So I've already cut the square. This is 20 inches square. And I've also already folded it into a triangle. And I ironed it. And you didn't have to do that, iron the fold in like I did, but my cutting board that I was using wasn't large enough for me to lay it out. So to make this easy to cut, I ironed a cutting line. So we're going to do that first. So using my ironing line. I'm going to cut this in half. Now I'm going to take this fabric and I am going to put it together in this shape. Sew these together. Now we're going to sew them right sides to right sides. So now we're going to sew that with a 1/4 inch seam. That has created this shape. I hesitate to tell you the shape. This is what it is. Now, of course, we're going to do some pressing. Now I need to measure 2.5 inch lines across my fabric. So here's 1, 2, oops, that's 2. Good thing that's washable. 2.5 here, 2.5, 2.5. It's not coming out right. 2.5, 5, 7.5, 10. I should not have that extra. And I'm going to do the same thing down here. I didn't have that extra. And now I'm going to connect those lines to draw cutting lines. Now we're going to mark all the lines until they're all drawn on here. Now you want to be careful not to stretch the fabric. I'm kind of pushing it down so that I'm not stretching it at all, because remember, the whole reason that we're doing a bias binding is because we want it to wear better, and that means it has more stretch in it. I'm not sure why there's an extra, because I checked my measurements. So we might come up short. So now what we're going to do is we are going to sew this into a cylinder. And we're going to do that by matching up the lines. Now, we want it to be just a little bit offset because we want it to be a loop. So this one, I'm going to start at the outside. So the first one that I'm going to pin is going to be the second one. And this is going to come together really quick. So I'm going to go through my little line, and I'm going to go through my line, I'm going to pin that together. And then I'm going to do that here. See, when we lay it out, is that those are going to continue in their little lines. And now we're going to sew it. Now again, you want to be really careful that you're not stretching it as you sew. And we're going to cut it. So now we're going to use our cutting lines. That's what we did all that measuring for. We're just going to start right here. And here it is. Now I don't know why I have this little weird piece. I don't know why this. Probably because of the 20-inch square. Let's make sure we have enough. So I need 2 times this length. And 2 times this length. And I am going to be short. So the worst that we have to do is we have to cut more. And interestingly enough, this is how much I'm short. So it had to have been I'm not sure why. I'm going to cut some more. Okay, we're in business again, and I'm not sure why I came up short. I missed my chart. I was trying to make do and something didn't work. I will try to find the chart online that I've been using. I've had it for over 20 some years. So I will try to find it and I'll put it in the description box if I can find it. I've never come up short before, so obviously there was something wrong in my math. But let's move on. Now what we're going to do first is, you guessed it, we're going to press. So now we've created this binding and now we need to iron it. So we're just going to fold it in half. And we're going to iron the entire length of it. Now you can actually buy a tool that you can run this through, and it will fold it for you. And I have used that. It's not hard to do it yourself. We're just folding it in half and ironing. You don't want to start in a corner. You want to start along a straight edge because you are going to have to meet the two pieces together, and you want to have plenty of space to do that. Now, I have left the edge on my quilt, and that's because it's going to make it a little bit easier to sew down, but I am going to add this little square to the back. This is the nameplate, and it should be important to you to put your name on your quilt. Quilts are an heirloom gift. You're giving something that you hope will be special to someone. You can see we spent a lot of time on this, and we hope that it's special to the person that we give it to. And so you should always put your name on your quilt, so in 50 years they don't look at this quilt and wonder who made it. Your name will be on the back so they know that you made it and for who. So I just sew a little square on the back that I will write my name on when we're all finished. Now to put this on here, I am going to have to cut this corner. Now I'm going to start right here, and you want to put the raw edge to the raw edge of your quilt. And you want to leave a tail here so you have some extra fabric to work with. Now that's going to make more sense why we've done that at the end, but that's how we're going to join the two ends together. So as we're sewing the binding onto the quilt, we're sewing it to the right side of the quilt, and we're going to do a 1/4 inch seam. Now I've got my walking foot on here, and again, slow and steady. Now one thing you want to be careful of is not to stretch the binding as you sew. We're creating a mitered corner like we did on the front of the quilt. So I'm going up, and I'm going to use my straight edge, put that on the edge of the quilt, and I'm going to fold this down. And so that makes a very sharp corner, and I'm going to show you that again more closely. Now once you fold it, you can take it out. I'm struggling with this foot a little bit, so I'm going to put a pin in this just so I can get it underneath the sewing machine, and then I'm going to take it out. So we're going to pull this treble, straight over to the edge, so it's straight out. I'm going to use my metal ruler, treble, trouble, bedtime. So you can see it nice and straight. My metal ruler goes in, and it's just a straight edge, that's all. And then I made my mitered corner. So I'm going to pin it just to be sure I don't lose it, and continue sewing. So we're going to flip that to the outside, nice and straight. I'm going to use my straight metal line, and I'm going to put a pin in it just so it won't come undone. And let me show you what the other end looks like. This is what you want it to look like on this end. so that it's going to fold over the corner. The binding is sewn down except for this little section. And the reason is because we need to join these two pieces together to make a continuous loop. And we're going to use our iron to help us with that. So I'm going to do the same thing I did previously. We're just going to line these up, laying it out. And remember, we're being careful not to stretch it. You want it to be straight, but not stretched. And we're going to iron that. That's going to become our sewing line. So now we're going to unfold this. And we're going to unfold this, and I should have done that a little longer. Actually, I'm going to do it longer because it's too hard to work with. So we're going to unfold it. And we're going to join those two lines together. And we're going to sew those together. Now I'm having a difficult night, so I'm not going to cut anything until I know it works. And that was wise, because it does it. So once they're pinned together, we're going to sew them together. And I'm not going to cut it until I know it fits. And that's going to be perfect. So it's safe to cut this. And we're going to sew it down. And you know what? This is the last seam with the sewing machine. Oh gosh. And that's it. The binding is sewed to the front of the quilt. Now it's not finished. There's one more step. And the last step requires hand sewing. Now what I'm going to do for now is I'm going to cut off all this extra. All right, so the last step, we're going to take this binding from the front, so we're pulling it over, and we're going to hand sew it to the back. And you can technically do this with the machine. I never have, because if you sew it that way, you're going to see it on the front. And the front is the showcase of the quilt. I don't want any ugly stitching on the front. So hand stitching is worth this step. It's going to be an easy stitch. It's called a whip stitch. And it's late, so this is going to have to wait for tomorrow. And it might take me more than one night, which that's okay. Because we are in the final stretch. And I don't know about you, but I love it. Everything came out perfect. I love my blocks. I love my applique. I love the way that we quilted the applique in the back. It's a really nice touch. So we're almost done. All right, friends, we are to the final step in the quilt making process. And it is almost time to present this quilt to baby Hunter and his mama and daddy. And I am so excited. I have worked so hard on it, and I really love how it's come out. I'm really happy with it. Let's wrap it up so we can give this gift to baby Hunter. Now the only step we have left is the binding. So we always sew the binding to the front of the quilt because we want that front to be nice and clean, crisp, nice lines, to look really sharp because it's the front of the quilt. It's going to frame it, it's going to finish it, and we want it to look its best. Now, what we have left, this is my quilt label, and you saw how I put it on the quilt, but this is a baby quilt. Now, on a wall quilt like this one up here, I wouldn't worry with this step. But on a baby quilt, I always sew this down because I don't want there to be any openings for a baby to get their fingers in there. So that's the first thing we're going to do, is we're going to sew that down. Everything from here on out is going to be hand sewn. So this is going to take... probably going to take me a few days to get this done because I can only really work on it in the evenings. So it's going to take a little while. And I've just threaded my needle and tucked that under. Now the tail of the thread, I want that to be underneath this flap. So I'm going to come in from the back so that that tail is going to be tucked inside where we're not going to see it. Now what we're going to do now is just a simple whip stitch. We are just going to sew this down. Now we want to be careful while we're doing this not to go through to the front of the quilt. So I have my finger right behind on the other side, and I'm just kind of feeling to make sure that I don't go all the way through because I don't want little white stitches on the front of my quilt. Now I decided just to pin that down because I'm kind of holding it at an angle so that you can see, and I don't want it to move and be in the wrong spot. Now this is the label of the quilt, and this is where I'm going to put who this quilt is for, and his birthday, and also my name. And I put my real name, not just that Gigi made this quilt, but I'll put my real name so that people know who made this quilt. When someday Hunter passes on this quilt to his son or his grandchild, they'll know that Gigi made this quilt and who Gigi was. Alright, so for the next step in the quilt, I am going to use a blue thread. And you could do it with white, but the binding is blue and the back is blue. I always like my binding to match the back of my quilt. It's just my preference. So I always do it that way because I like it to be nice and finished on the back. Now, I struggle with blue and black, telling them apart. I think this is blue. Pretty sure this is black. The lights are helpful, but I'm going to have Philip check it to make sure. It was blue, but I wanted to be positive because I don't want to do all this work and then it'd be the wrong color. So I tied my knot, and you want to use a usable length of thread. If they're too long, it's kind of cumbersome to work with, and you just want to be comfortable when you're doing it. Now it doesn't matter where we start, so I'm just going to pick a spot. Not on a corner though. And all we're going to do is we're going to take the binding from the front. We're going to just drop my needle. Oops. So we're just going to take the binding from the front and we're going to turn it over to the back and we're going to sew it down. That's it. And we're going to do that little whip stitch just like we did for that label. And I'm also going to tuck my knot inside the binding so that I won't see it. Now you might not need a thimble for this. I'm not wearing one right now. If my fingers get tender, then I'll wear a thimble. And even though we're using a matching thread, we still want to be careful not to poke through the front of the face of the quilt. We don't want all these little stitches to show on the face. Now the binding that I cut was at 2.5 inches. And you can see that that is just covering the edge. It's perfect actually, it's not too big. Sometimes if you cut it too long, it goes over a long way on the front of on the back of the quilt. We don't want that. We just want it to cover these raw edges. Now this is a really easy step of the quilt making, but it does take time because it's hand quilted. Now, it's hand sewn. Now you can put bindings on with a machine. I just prefer not to. I just like the finished look. Now I attached it with the machine, but you can do both sides. So both sides would be finished with a machine, the front and the back. But this is just my preference to do it this way, finishing it by hand on the back. And that's all there is to it. And I think this has 157 inches of quilt edge. So I'd say we have 156 more inches to go. And just to give you a preview of the front, that's how it's going to look. Nice and clean. Now the nice part about hand quilting is that you can do it anywhere. Now the machine quilting requires that I sit at the table and use the machine. But the hand quilting can be done anywhere. And I am going to take this to my bed and relax while I do this part of the quilting. Now, one thing I want to tell you, this seam line right here, that white line, is how the binding is attached to the front. When you fold it over, you want to make sure that that seam is covered. You want to cover it up, especially where this one is white on that blue. We want that covered up. If this is too thick, we'll trim it so that it tucks into this nicely. Because I'm getting to a section that's kind of thick that I might need to trim up a little bit more. Now I'm to the end of my first thread. Now I'm doing the same thing. I'm tucking my knot inside of my binding so that nothing shows. So that's how far I got. A foot. And we just keep on going till we finish. Now I'm going to go take this someplace more comfortable, so I will catch up with you in a little bit later. Now I'm almost to the next corner, and I'm going to show you how I do a corner. So when you finish your corners, you want them to be nice and clean, lay nice and flat. And so that's the end goal. So the first thing I'm going to do before I get there is I'm going to trim off some of this bulk so that I can work around that corner a little bit better. And I'm just going to snip very tip off. Just a little bit so I have some room to work. Now I needed to do that now because I'm almost there. I've only got like 1.5 inches left and I wanted space to do that. So I've gone ahead and prepped that corner. And let me stitch up to the corner. And as we get closer to the corner, we're prepping for that. So I'm pushing down the binding so it lays really nicely as we lead into the corner. Now I'm going to switch views so you can see. So as I'm approaching that corner, I'm laying my binding the way I want it, nice and flat. And I'm going to stitch right up there to the end. Now that I'm about there, I want to start preparing the opposite corner. So I'm going to fold that over. to be folded nice and neat. So I'm going to go ahead and put a stitch right here where I know that's going to meet. Now I go back and stitch this little edge. Now, I don't know if you're supposed to do that. I know most people would not stitch this little opening right here, but I do. And I want to grab this corner here a little bit better. There. Now I'm just going to tuck my needle down underneath to get back to the edge. And I continue along the side. It is finished! Hunter's baby quilt is completely done. I have finished all of the steps, and I have to tell you, I am so happy with the finished product. Now, as you've seen in the videos, it didn't all go smoothly, but at the end, the finished product is beautiful. The quilt came out lovely, and I think it's a beautiful gift to give to our 4th grandbaby. So thank you so much for watching, friends. Appreciate you coming along for the journey. If you missed any of the other videos in this quilt making series, I'm going to put a playlist right up here so that you can watch all of them and see this quilt from design to finish. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time. Here's a little behind the scenes how I am filming this so that you can see my stitches and me. Here we go.